Mr. Rusbridger, you've got the floor.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It seems to me a very important one to be having, and I will try and cover three areas. One is about the nature of the debate. One is to try and inform you about our reporting and how we've gone about it. And the other is to touch on what I think the role of lawmakers and parliaments should be. I'll return to this, but the overall scope of what we've been writing about and why it matters is the subject matter that you're exploring, which is about this new thing in intelligence, which is placing mass populations, entire populations, under a form of surveillance. And that seems to me something that is new, hasn't been debated properly. It's something that everybody from the President of the United States down says has to be debated, and yet there has not been the information on which to base that debate. And that is why the role of reporting, and whether countries encourage that reporting or try to suppress it, is such an important one. So perhaps I can just tell you a little bit about how this story came into being and how we've been attempting to report it and the challenges and responsibilities of doing so have worked. So in mid-May, as I think is known, we were approached by Edward Snowden. And I think it's important to understand that he approached, in a sense, two entities by coming to us. He approached the individual journalist, Glenn Greenwald, who, if you like, is part of The Guardian, but also part of what we might call the Fifth Estate, the new digital sphere of information, which is not just traditional journalists. So Glenn Greenwald is a lawyer, he's a blogger, and he's a journalist. And he was approached by Edward Snowden because he wrote so knowledgeably and responsibly and in such an informed way about this subject. And I think Snowden recognized him as somebody who would write about this knowledgeably. And he also writes for The Guardian, which is a paper that has a monthly worldwide audience of something like 80 million unique browsers. So it's a highly important vehicle for debate. But Glenn Greenwald is both part of this new world and part of The Guardian. The writing of the story has been a complex one, partly because of the subject matter. So the subject matter is about the penetration of communications and the ability of agencies and states to be inside emails, phone calls, texts, messages. And this presents a problem for journalists, and it is one of the themes that we have been exploring about whether journalism itself and whether having confidential sources is possible in this new age. So a world in which Greenwald, an American citizen living in Rio, an editing team in New York, and at various times the story taking place in Hong Kong and Russia, and trying to edit it from London, is one that engages many problems, including legal ones. So you have a different set of legal rules in America from those that exist in London, for instance. The material, examining the material involved problems of security and how you would securely look through this material. It involved fine editorial judgments about the responsibility of what was involved, and I would like to just say a little bit about that we were clear from the outset that we were not going to do anything that would identify agents, that would compromise operations. We were not going to treat this material as a kind of brand tub to search for stories. I think we have behaved responsibly, and in some of our discussions with the British government this has been acknowledged, that we've behaved responsibly. We have been, in 90% of the stories, we have gone to the governments and companies in advance and listened to their response. And I think we have acted responsibly throughout in our reporting. At some point we have run across the laws I mentioned earlier. And the laws in different countries make this kind of reporting either difficult or impossible or allowable. And it will be obvious, I think, to the lawmakers that are sitting there listening to this, I hope, that there have been at least two instances where we violently disagree with the way that the law has tried to interfere with our reporting. One was the use of terror legislation to intercept and detain David Miranda, who was part of the team of people at The Guardian, and the other was the direct threat from the British government that they would use the law to prevent us from to either seek the return or the destruction of the material that we were looking at. And that is why we are now in collaboration with American partners, because the American laws, the First Amendment in particular, offer a more robust protection for this kind of reporting than exists certainly in Britain, but I would guess in much of Europe. It seems to me that Article 10 is not the same as the First Amendment of the United States, and working in a country where prior restraint of publishing, stopping things from being published in advance, is not possible in America. And therefore we're in this new journalistic environment which we are taking advantage of, in which we take advantage of the best legal regime in which to publish in examples where states move against and try to prevent reporting within Europe. So that is how the story came about. That's how we've been trying to work on this material. There have been issues of security of communications that I've referred to. There have been issues of security of the material. It has, as I've tried to emphasize, been an exercise in teamwork. There are several reporters and editors who have worked alongside Glenn Greenwald and used Glenn Greenwald's expertise and his knowledge, combined with our editing skills, our legal and IT backup, the kind of things that a newspaper, a proper newspaper, a well-resourced newspaper wanting to do journalism in the public interest is still able to do. We will have at the end of it, I think, enormous legal bills in trying to defend and enable our reporting, but that, to my mind, is something that a newspaper has to be able to do. And we have entered partnerships, as I've referred to, with the New York Times and with ProPublica in order to enable reporting that it turns out is impossible to do in the UK. I just want to end by talking about why this story seems to me worth going to this effort, with all these challenges and difficulties, why it is important that a newspaper does this kind of reporting in a responsible way. And it comes back to where I started. In the old world, espionage was about state on state. It was a targeted activity in which people used highly targeted techniques in order to spy on others. And what has happened in the last period of 10 or 15 years is that this has moved into a world in which there has been a partnership of states and corporations that we are beginning to glimpse through the Snowden documents that has involved the mass harvesting of information of entire populations, anybody who uses digital equipment being put under some form of surveillance. And that seems to me is something which cannot happen without consent. It cannot happen without the consent of populations. And that consent cannot be given without information. You can't have the kind of debate that you are having today in your parliament unless you have information on which to base that debate. So you can't simultaneously have governments trying to stop newspapers from publishing this and have that debate. So I welcome the fact that the President of the United States, that President Obama, even yesterday, said that this was a debate that was necessary, that just because you can do things doesn't mean that you should do things, and he acknowledged that things had gone wrong, and that these were necessary matters of discussion. But you can't have that discussion without the information. And I acknowledge there has to be a balance. I think we all acknowledge there has to be a balance between security and privacy and freedom of speech and freedom of association and the ability to report. But these are all things that have to be placed in the balance. And what tends to happen is that the security bit of the argument is the only one that gets heard. So in the discussions that we have with government, of course, the security side of the argument says you shouldn't be publishing any of this. I've had senior officials within the British government saying you've had your debate, now stop. And to me it is not for the state to be telling journalists when to stop. It is that debate has to start now, and that debate which is necessary in order to have the consent of people to employ these mass and new ways of surveillance that affect everything that they do in their digital lives can't be had without journalism. And so I welcome the fact that you are having this debate. I think it's important that you should, and I think it is for all lawmakers in all countries in the free world which are going to be subject to these increasingly intrusive methods of surveillance, because the engineers who are building this stuff will always be ahead of the laws. It's an important role of Parliament to consider these balances and to be considering how oversight is done and whether oversight is meaningful and whether the current oversight powers that exist through secret courts and through the committees of Parliament and Congress, whether these oversight powers have been sufficiently exercised in the past and whether they're meaningful in the future. So thank you for asking me. As I say, what I've tried to emphasize today are these three things: the need for the debate, the need for responsible journalism, and the need for lawmakers to protect that journalism and to discuss the material that we are putting into the public domain at some risk to ourselves and expense and against severe legal obstacles, and that lawmakers have a role to protect that kind of journalism and to encourage that kind of debate. Thank you.
With Mr. Rusbridger, we thank you for your time and for your answers.
First of all, you'll have to excuse my linguistic skills, so I'll answer the questions in English, but the two questions that were not in English, if anybody can help me, but I didn't get translation. But let me answer the questions in English. The first question on the effect on journalism of these interventions, the use of terror terror legislation and the threat of injunction, I can't help but answer that these will be chilling. These will be chilling, and they are obstructive to journalism. There was a blog written by a former CIA agent, which I can supply the reference to, which indicated that these were perhaps techniques just to throw sand in the gears, to try and slow down our journalism or to intimidate our journalism. I can't speak for the motives, but the effect of using inappropriate legislation and of threatening injunctions is bound to be chilling to journalism. And the question of what this will do, the question of the aspect of whistleblowers, I mean, I can't help thinking of the kind of whistleblowers that the West would like to encourage. So the argument has been put to me that there is an asymmetry here, that we reveal the secrets of Snowden, but we don't reveal the secrets of Chinese whistleblowers. Well, we would love to have Chinese whistleblowers and Russian whistleblowers and Iranian whistleblowers, but we have to look at the signals that we send. So if we lock up whistleblowers for 60 years in the West as our way of signaling what we think of whistleblowers, how can we possibly encourage Chinese or Russian or Iranian whistleblowers to come and talk to The Guardian using the protections of the First Amendment or Article 10 in Europe? There was an interesting article in India recently about the whistleblowers that have died in India. These are the act of whistleblowers is something that, to my mind, deserves some protection. So the combination of the use of punitive laws against whistleblowers and inappropriate legislation to silence the work of journalists. I think people in Western governments ought to think about how the signals that we're sending to the rest of the world by this kind of behavior. That's the answer to the first question. The next question in English was about whether The Guardian would be pursuing legal charges over the destruction of the discs. I think the short answer to that is no, because this was a voluntary act by myself in order to defeat the likelihood of an injunction that would be able to stop my reporting, and in knowledge that it wasn't going to stop my reporting anyway, because we had copies, as I advised the British government, elsewhere in the world. So I don't think legal action is the right route for that. The question about why there hasn't been more concern in Europe, I think it's been patchy. I think in some countries in Europe I felt very strong expressions of support from editors and from free speech organizations. But I think in a way this dovetails with the question about the response in the UK and whether this is tied up with Leveson. It may be that people are not stepping back and seeing the big picture, and how this behavior by governments to inhibit the journalism is directly related to the ability to have a debate about this. And for some reason, and it may be to do with national cultures and national cultures' experience of oversight of intelligence and the bad things that can happen when there is this kind of capability for surveillance. I think maybe there's a question of individual cultures that informs the extent to which people are concerned. But all I can say is there has been a very vigorous debate in some countries, a lot of support for what The Guardian has been doing, and a lot of support for Glenn Greenwald and for Snowden. So I think all I can say is that it's been a patchy response, and Leveson may be a factor that has a particular traction on the UK response. There was a question, I think, about European safeguards, and I suppose my answer to that is that I'm not a lawyer, And I know there is Article 10 in Europe, and which is incorporated into British law. And I think it's an interesting question why, in the view of journalists, most journalists that I know, Article 10 doesn't have the same weight that the First Amendment of the American Constitution does. And I think it would be a common feeling amongst European journalists that we don't have the same protection against prior restraint and in favor of free expression that exists in the United States. As I say, I'm not a lawyer, but I can only express my view as a journalist. And one of the reasons why I think journalists should be more concerned about the picture that is emerging from the Snowden documents is this one, that journalism itself is potentially threatened by this degree of surveillance. So that the more authorities who have oversight of material, and that doesn't have to be the content of emails, it can just be the so-called metadata, i.e. who has been in touch with who is emailing who, and about what. That's all, or who has been searching for what in what search engine. That is so-called metadata. It appears to be harmless. It is collected in vast quantities now, but that kind of information absolutely tells you who journalists are in touch with and who their sources are. And journalism therefore becomes deeply threatened by these techniques of mass surveillance. And we found that all these mass surveillance systems are, of course, themselves not secure. That's one of the ironies of this story, that I've had to sit there and be lectured by people about our own security, where the only people who have so far leaked material have been the agencies that are supposed to keep this material safe. In terms, I think the final question in English, and I apologize again for not answering the questions that were not in English. That's my British linguistic skills, which I'm sure you're familiar with in the Parliament. The systems of oversight that somebody asked about, the alternatives, I think that comes down to the questions of oversight. Somebody asked whether this kind of mass collection of data was reconcilable with free societies. I think the answer does come down to the oversight systems and whether secret courts are an appropriate mechanism for dealing with them, or an effective mechanism, and we're getting some sense of how the FISA courts work in the US and the extent to which their critics are right when they accuse them of being rubber stamp courts, or the extent to which they are making robust choices. And I don't know the extent to which the congressional oversight and the parliamentary oversight are effective or not. Whether these people are regulators or whether they become captured by the communities they're supposed to be regulating. Because I don't know what they see. I don't know if they've seen the documents that we've seen, or whether they see a small fraction of the documents that we've seen. And there's no way of knowing because the whole thing is so secret. So I think my final message to the lawmakers is, as I've said before, please find ways of protecting journalism, because journalism is your only way to have this debate which everyone now says is necessary, but which government themselves are never going to encourage and the intelligence services are never going to welcome. So it is only journalism that is going to give you an inadequate and partial view into this world based on what a whistleblower has given us. Please protect us as journalists, and please think about these mechanisms of oversight and how oversight can be meaningful, and whether it has been meaningful. And I don't know who can do that job, but it seems to me It has to be lawmakers, and they have to find ways of comparing the material we have, and I would welcome any thoughts the European Parliament have on what should happen to this material. Comparing the material, the raw data, and comparing that with what the oversight committees have seen, because then you will have some sense of whether the supposed oversight bodies are operating in an informed way, or whether they themselves have only a very partial view of what has been going on.
Mr. Rusbridger, final minute. Thank you for being here.
Okay. On the payment, no, we didn't pay for any information. The question about parliaments and judges, I hope I've answered in my previous answer. And on the question about whether we acknowledge any boundaries of security, of course, as I think I said in my first answer, these are difficult balances. And I hope in our responsible reporting we have made a distinction between things that threaten national security, where I don't believe we have gone, and things about essentially civilian matters, the civil life of people who use digital communications, i.e. everyone. And there is a balance to be had there, but that balance is not found in the response of intelligence agencies who simply say, you mustn't publish any of this. If we were to publish none of that, then you couldn't have a balanced argument, because you wouldn't know what to put in the balance with national security. So these are difficult questions. I acknowledge there's a balance, and all I can say is it has to be for the responsible judgment of papers like The Guardian and New York Times, and Washington Post, to make that kind of material, that kind of discussion in conversation with the intelligence agencies, but not only the intelligence agencies, because there is a civil liberties aspect to this, there is a press freedom aspect, so they are not the only voices that have to be heard in this discussion. To my French colleague about the this business of European protections, I think I come back to my previous answer. I don't fully understand why Article 10 doesn't have the full bite, impact and protection that I would like it to have. Certainly in the UK courts, we certainly welcome Article 10, and it's proved a useful arguing point, but it's still, I think, in recent jurisprudence, most British journalists would not feel that Article 10 has had quite the force in terms of protecting free speech that we would have hoped.
We thank you, Mr. Alan Rusbridger, Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian. We thank you for your contribution.